For session 11 tonight, we're going to be talking about the steps to leadership maturity. Over the past several weeks, we've been reflecting on the temptations that face leaders. Tonight, I would like to complete our study of the temptations that our Lord had in Matthew chapter 4. Jesus was taken up onto the top of a high mountain. Verse 8 says, "The devil showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." As we think about this temptation, the temptation was one to shortcut God's whole plan and process. Satan said to Jesus, if you will just bow down and worship me, you don't have to go through the plan that God has laid out for you to establish your kingdom. I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. The world is before us, and you can have it if you'll just bow down and worship me. Well, how does that relate to Christian leadership? How does that relate to leadership maturity, our subject for tonight? I think part of the temptation that we as leaders experience in our lives is the temptation to use power in a way that would bring about the success of God's work. The temptation to use power to accomplish our objectives. And that's clearly not what the Scriptures challenge us to do. That's not what Jesus did. In mission organizations, we often have a centralized structure. And at the center, you have finances, and you have a hierarchy. You have leadership that can use the structure and the resources to get the job done. If we rely upon those things, if we rely upon the hierarchy, upon the power structure, if we rely upon the resources that we have, the temptation will be to trust ourselves and to trust our central organization instead of to trust God. If we did that, we would commit the sin that Satan tempted Jesus with here in this text. Jesus could have shortcut God's plan and purpose. He could have had all the kingdoms of the world at his footsteps by just bowing and worshiping Satan. But to do it, he would have destroyed his complete ministry. As you think about the power that you have in a mission organization, the power that you have with the resources that God has given you, if you are tempted to use those resources to accomplish your purpose, you're stepping into the temptation that Satan gave to Jesus in this context. Jesus said, "Away from me, Satan. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only." The point here is that our worship and our service is in humility to God. We cannot rely upon our centralized organizations. We must not rely upon our money and our power. We must rely upon God, and our worship of him should be that which leads us in our leadership process. As we reflect on these things in the lectures tonight, I hope that you keep always before you this temptation that our Lord faced. And remember that he rejected it on behalf of the cross. He was willing to go to the cross instead of doing this, that he could accomplish God's purpose. There's no more profound illustration of what we are called to as leaders than that. We must follow him to the cross. Well, good evening. Welcome back after Thanksgiving and a whole host of other activities. Tonight we're on page 52 in your syllabus, lecture 21. This is the 11th session of the class, and we'll have one more series of lectures after tonight, and actually next week will be more of a discussion than a lecture. So welcome back, and tonight we're going to be looking at the conclusion of our study of Richard Adams and his theory of power and its relationship to political process. The two lectures for this evening, the first lecture, we're going to try to draw together some of the key themes that we've been looking at through the course. I'm going to have to move somewhat rapidly in this lecture this evening, and I hope that if you get lost, you'll bear with me. We'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions as we go on. The first thing that I want to talk about as we begin this lecture tonight is that as we look at levels of complexity in terms of human social organization and political life, we've got to add a new variable that we really haven't talked about, and that is the difference in terms of economic life in world societies. We've been emphasizing primarily power and political leadership. We've looked at grid and group social dimensions. As we think about this last thing, we're going to be looking at variations in terms of economic life. To illustrate that, I've just drawn a little diagram here to begin with, which is rather crude, but which will help us begin to think in terms of grid and group and in terms of some other factors that we want to work with. As I mentioned before, the economic is the one that we want to consider. So in looking at economics, I think I'll use this smaller pen if it still writes. We'll talk first of all about subsistence, and secondly about peasant economies, and thirdly about industrial economies. Now the difference between these is in terms of the sophistication and the scope of the economic life of the people. Subsistence economy is basically oriented toward the strategy of survival. People getting enough food to be able to live and to feed their families and to reproduce for another generation. There's no attempt to have markets. There's no attempt to try to trade with other people, except as it's absolutely necessary to subsist. People, of course, have traded in every dimension of time, in every dimension of human history. But in this particular economic level of society, the trading is primarily to acquire the things that one must have to basically live and survive. Usually the trade in these types of economies would have to do with some basic tools or basic materials that one would have to live the kind of life that one has. Subsistence economies usually do not produce surplus. They're economies that are based upon producing just enough to feed yourselves. If there is a surplus, it's usually consumed in feasting or destroyed. In other words, it's something that people do not have to pass on to others. Peasant economy, in contrast, is one in which surplus production is an essential part of it. Peasants are people who live on land that usually they are not the owners of. They're often tenant farmers, or they're people who live in relationship to a larger society, and they produce a surplus to feed a hierarchy. Sometimes this is called a tribute economy. If some of you may be familiar with Eric Wolf's book, and tribute is a key characteristic of peasant societies. But peasant societies exist in every part of what we know as the Third World today. There are societies in which people are predominantly agricultural or produce or herd livestock for their economic livelihood, and they sell the surplus in the marketplace, or they give the surplus in tribute to the rulers that govern them and that have prior ownership to their land or their soil. The great civilizations of the world, China, India, the ancient civilizations of Europe, the Middle East, all were peasant societies. They basically operated on the basis of a peasant economy in which many people produced food, and the rulers collected the surplus and used it to support their ruling systems. The culture of the Romans at the time of Christ was a peasant economy. The rulers were the major leaders in the Roman Empire, the military, those that were in the Senate. The peasants were those that worked as tenants on the land, and there was a vast host of peasant producers throughout the Roman Empire. An industrial empire, or an industrial level of economy, I should say, is a level of economy where people do not have surplus which they market, people market their labor. The key difference between a peasant economy is that people in a peasant economy have their own labor and they do with it what they please. They work on the land or they don't. Whereas in an industrial economy, you don't own land, you don't own factories. Most of us are people who work for somebody else. We basically sell our labor in the marketplace. And so an industrial economy is one that operates on the basis of wage labor, and that is the dominant form of life. Now, as we think about these three different economic levels, they are levels of economic organization that create tremendous impact in terms of how society works. What I want to suggest to you that at each one of these levels, you can find all four dimensions of grid and group. In other words, you have down here, we labeled these in terms of our discussion earlier, A, B, C, and D. So we'll just keep those labels. We have A here, B here, C, and D in each one of these. A being the individualist, B being the bureaucratic, C being the corporate and D being the collectivist type of social environments that we've talked about. So if we look at this as being grid and this as being group, in terms of the kind of discussion we've had earlier, you see then that grid and group replicates itself at every one of these economic levels. When you go to the mission field, which many of you are interested in doing, you may work in a major industrial city like Hong Kong, which is a participant in an industrial society. Or you could possibly work in a peasant village in China, which would be operating at this particular level of social organization. Or you might even have an opportunity to work with a subsistence tribal group in the interior of Malaysia and be working with people at this particular level of social organization. It's possible anywhere in the world today to have an opportunity to work at any one of these economic levels. They have significant impact in terms of how the society is organized, its relative wealth, the kind of roles that people fulfill. But what we find is that the grid and group phenomena is replicated at every economic level. And so it doesn't matter where in the world you are and what level of economic life that you're talking about, the social dimensions that we've described through the grid and group framework are found in each of these. The question for us this evening is, what does this economic variation mean in terms of leadership and in terms of political development and political authority? Richard Adams addresses this in his book. I did not ask you to read this section, or if I did, yeah, you did read this section, okay? The middle section I skipped. So I gave you that to read. But he does discuss this in terms of phases of growth, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit this evening. In thinking about phases of change, what we're looking at is how does a society move from one subsistence level to another, from subsistence, for example, to an industrial economy. What happens in that process? What kind of changes occur? What kind of changes particularly occur in terms of leadership? How do people move from a peasant to an industrial society? What are the implications of that? Back in 1977, I worked with a Dani Indian group that was a subsistence level society in the interior of Brazil. When I went to Africa in 1978, just 1 year later, I worked with a group, a village called Mbem, which is really a peasant village, producing surplus, participating in a national economy, but at a peasant level of social and economic organization. But you didn't have to travel far. You just go a few miles in a taxi, well, a few hours in a taxi, and you'd come to a city called Bamenda, and you'd find industry there, people manufacturing. And if you went to some of the other major cities in the country, you've got people basically selling their labor in factories to do work. And so you have the possible transition within the same country and driving in a vehicle from one place to another, from subsistence economies to peasant economies to industrial economies. What does that mean? What kind of transformations does it create? How does the whole leadership structure and the whole system of organization integration change as you have these economic transformations? In reflecting on this, Adams proposes that there are certain kinds of phases that society has gone through historically, and that those phases may be replicated in the present as people make changes. For example, as Dani Indians decide to move downriver to a town and begin working in a town. What will they do? Will they move into a peasant kind of relationship with the townspeople? Will they move into an industrial kind of relationship? Will they replicate their individualism here? Will they change that into something else? What will happen as they move from one place to another? In trying to answer that question, Adams talks about 4 processes. And in thinking about this evening, if you look at your syllabus, I've identified them there, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first phase of growth is aggregation by identity. As we think about this, it's a fairly simple thing. It's basically we believe that we belong because we have a common identity. We are setting ourselves apart from other people because we have a common name, or we have a common residence, or something of that nature that provides a way of bringing people together. Aggregation by identity is probably the simplest kind of grouping that one can have. Every year on Labor Day, a group of people gather at a park back in Pennsylvania in a little town called Martinsburg. and they have a picnic. And the reason they come there is because they all have a common relationship to some Lingenfelters that are my ancestors. And they come to that place and they have a picnic together because of that particular identity and that connection to the ancestors. Now, they really don't do anything else together. Nothing. In other words, they don't work together. They don't help each other out in terms of financial needs. They maybe send Christmas cards to each other, but not all of them even do that. They don't really have any other kind of corporate activity at all. The only thing that they do in common with one another is they have that picnic on Labor Day. And they do that because of this identity that they've had in the past. Now, we call that an aggregate of people who just are together because they've got some identity link. But there's nothing more sophisticated in terms of their social relationships, nothing more sophisticated in terms of their economic relationships that unite them. They do not have a common bonding that ties them together. The second type of, or the second phase, I would say, of coordination, of growth, is what Adams calls coordination. And coordination is characterized by the reciprocal granting of power. In other words, the people get together and they decide to give one another rights about their relationships, to work together in some kind of a common purpose and a common plan. Now, in thinking about this, let's take those Lingenfelters at the picnic. If some of those Lingenfelters said, you know, it would be really nice if we could do something special to remember our parents. Maybe it would be good if every year we gave some member of the family a trip somewhere in honor of our father. What do you think about that? Shall we do that? And so they said, yeah, let's do it. Let's take up a collection. And so they went around in the group and they begin to take up a collection. They say, what we want to do is we want to get up enough money so that we have enough to buy 2 airplane tickets to anywhere in the United States. We'll get them at the cheapest rate, so we can probably do that with about $400 each. So we'll provide 2 round-trip air tickets every year. Now, to accomplish that, each of you really need to contribute. And so they begin to talk about it, and they begin to negotiate with one another, and they say, well, you know, so-and-so has got a better job than the rest of us. We should ask him to give a little more. And, you know, he's got his house paid for, and he's retired. He could contribute a little more. And you talk together, and you work together, and you get them to do something like this. They have changed from an identity group to a coordinated group because they begin to grant power to one another to accomplish something that they feel is important as a group and do it in common. Now, if they actually do that, the cohesion that is there will become stronger than it was before because somebody will have to collect that money and somebody will have to put it in the bank or to do something to take care of it. And they'll have to work to coordinate that together and to decide how the prize is going to be given the next year, who's going to select a prize, and what will happen that they could do that. Now, in fact, if they decided to do that and did it over a longer period of time, they would have become a coordinated unit. They would have organized themselves through the granting of power with one another to be more than an aggregate. They have become a working group, something that has some meaningful relationship in terms of others. Now, in the framework that we've been considering in the course, we have always drawn our grid and group box like this. And so we have the grid factor here, the group factor here. In thinking about these variables, what we have is the beginning of coordination is the moving up group. Well, my papers won't stay on here. So coordination is this movement up group. As people who are aggregate begin to move in this process of coordination, they're increasing their group cohesion, and that becomes an important dimension. So the first phase that Adams, well, this first phase of centralization, the coordinating phase, is what we would call in our social terms moving up group, developing more of a group cohesion, uniting together. Now the next phase that Adams talks about is centralization. And centralization is the process of moving up grid. Put it in this term, centralization is moving up in this direction. And so what we have is coordination being this component moving up group. Centralization is the movement up grid that follows. Now centralization happens when, Adams says, the majority focus relationships on a minority of one. In other words, the Lingenfelters elect a president of the Lingenfelter clan. And the Lingenfelters say that this president and his cabinet will have a cabinet of 2 women and 1 man, so that you have a president and 3 others that serve the cabinet. The cabinet will have the responsibility of collecting from each family their contribution to this annual ticket. Now what that means is it's no longer just a matter of granting power, that the people that say, hey, we want to belong to this thing are now going to be taxed. And they're going to be told by the president and the cabinet that they need to contribute. They'll be followed up with letters. They'll badger them until they get their contribution, so that we're sure every year that somebody's going to have, there's going to be enough money and that somebody will get the prize. And so in doing this, what happens is it's now not merely just coordination. We're agreeing, yeah, we'll participate. But we form a central authority. We give them particular role responsibility, and they begin to act to enforce among those who are participants the cooperation and participation in this particular organization. Fascinating example of this I discovered when I was in Hong Kong a few years ago. My friend Dr. Pang took me out to his home village. And he took me into the village, what you might call the village office. Yeah, the village office. And he took me upstairs in the village office and showed me the pictures of all the important people on the wall, and his was one of them. These are the people that got educated, and these are the ones who were recognized by the village clan as important achievers from the village. Now, he said it's very important to keep in contact with the village and with the leaders of the village, because the village owns a lot of land. And the village has made a significant amount of profit from the land. And if you are on the roll, you then get a share of that profit every year. And so it's important to keep your clan relationship, because your clan relationship entitles you to a share in the clan profits. And the village is not merely a village, it's an important clan, a Chinese clan, and to be a member of that clan entitles you to certain privileges and benefits from it. So he was very proud of the fact that his picture was on the wall, and also happy that he gets money from the clan every year because he's part of the corporate group. And it's organized. There are village officers, there is a village council and mayor or whatever it is that has responsibility in that. So it's a centralized organization. It has a focused leadership, and there are some people, a minority of people, who've been given authority by the whole to do this. Now if you tried this with the Lingenfelters, they'd probably all say, go jump in the lake. That's a term that I heard growing up, and that's the way they dealt with things. You know, they said, we're not going to do this, forget it, you know. I've got to give this money. When will I might get my ticket? I might never get one. Go jump in the lake. We're not going to give you the money. And they would say, forget it. So that probably wouldn't work among my particular group. But clearly with the Chinese village, it was centralized, it was coordinated in a significant way, and there were significant economic benefits. Now the centralization process is one in which you have allocated power and delegated power. And we've talked about those in the past, so I don't need to discuss that further this evening. The key thing there, of course, is that you have a group of people who agree to follow the leadership of those who are chosen to be the centralized core of the group. Now sometimes what happens is that the core group scatters. And you have people that move out of the particular core area and they live scattered over a larger area. They may not really have any cohesive interest in the village anymore. Let's take Dr. Pang's village, for example. There's not enough land in the village for every descendant of the village to live in the village. And so many of them live in other places in Hong Kong. Some of them live in other places of the world. They want to keep their name on the roll because they want to keep getting their share of the profits from the village. But they really don't attend village meetings. They don't go out there to talk about the business of the village. They really don't participate much in it except to be sure that they get their particular share every year. And so what happens there is that sometimes you get the process of fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs when the group gets so large that it's difficult for them to meet together and cooperate together and work together as a group. And at the same time, those in power, because of the size, gain greater power because the group no longer can hold them as accountable, because the group in itself is so large. The group gets large, it begins to split, it has factions in it, and so the tendency is for the group to fragment, divide up into factions or segments, and those in power gain more power that way because they can play the fragments against each other. And so they can begin to take more power to themselves, and the group itself then becomes factioned, and it doesn't have the ability to withdraw power as it would if it were much more cohesive. When the group is very strong, you see, it can remove its leaders very easily. But when the group is split and there are factions within it, then the factions will then contest with one another, and the leaders can manipulate that. And the leaders can have particular power that becomes independent of the support of the group. And so fragmentation is the process of moving down grid. Up group, but down grid. We've talked in our discussion earlier about administered units when we looked at Richard Adams. And in fact, in your syllabus on page 55, you have a graph that's very much like the one I'm drawing up here on the board that illustrates this in the complicated way that you can see on the page I'm holding up here. If you look at page 55, you can see the graph there that illustrates what we've been discussing. On that particular graph, you'll notice now that I've written in there the different kind of units that you see described in Adams' work. We discussed this much earlier in our lecture system. At the very bottom in the corner A there, you have aggregate units, and the aggregate units then are replaced by identity units. The identity unit is a unit where that's the Lingenfelters at their picnic, okay? When the Lingenfelters begin to work together, it becomes a coordinated unit. And the coordinated unit is one where you have granting of power and reciprocal action together, doing something in a coordinated way. Consensus units is when nothing can be done unless we agree with one another, unless we agree that we're all going to work together. So when you come up with a consensus unit, you really are committed to always working together to agreeing on what you're going to do. Consensus is difficult to sustain when you get large groups, and the larger the group gets, the harder consensus is to maintain. And so consensus yields to majority. And majority units, as the groups get larger, replace consensus. They're more coordinated in terms of centralized leadership. You have to have centralized leadership to keep a majority in power. And the outcome of that is often corporate units which have a much higher grid organization and structure. And then finally we end with what we've called administered units, which are moving now in this direction. The first thing we talked about, aggregation, is when everything falls apart and it drops down to be just a pile of rock. Okay? In other words, the whole system collapses and what's left is the pieces, and the pieces are merely aggregates. They're basically, there's no cohesion in them. They're disconnected with one another and they become just a splintered pile. Now effectively what we have is this kind of a dynamic occurring within society. And it can go in any direction here. I've drawn the arrows this way, but in actual fact we could put the arrows with a point on both ends. Okay? Because coordination can also be reversed and become aggregation. Okay? And centralization can drop back down the coordination, and fragmentation can go back to centralization depending on the dynamic forces that are at work there. And so this whole process Adams calls oscillation. You know, there's moving back and forth and having the potential to go in either of these directions. So it's helpful to understand that this process can be it can go in either direction, and it's not necessarily a unidirectional kind of process. But if a society gets increasingly complex, it will be moving through this cycle. That's ordinarily the way it happens.
Does this happen on a macro level too? If that's the case, why are there sustained, industrial nations that tend to stay at the high grid, low grid?
Okay, does it happen at a macro level? That's what I was trying to illustrate for you in terms of this diagram here. Yes. If you can take what I have illustrated here and place it on each one of these scales, you can see at any economic level you have the same kind of oscillation process occurring. For example, in the United States, if you go back and look at the history of America, people came to America to be independent. They wanted to have their own land, their own independent lives. They wanted to live apart from the hierarchy and the structure of Europe. They came for religious freedom. They came for political freedom. They came for economic freedom. They were looking for some way to have a life of their own. Now, when they came, they established different kinds of groups. The Puritans tried this kind of society here. Very high corporate society, tightly structured. They brought with them the hierarchy from England, but into a Puritan lifestyle and said, we want religious freedom, and so they worked here. But there are other people that came with them that said, hey, we don't like living under the tight domination of Puritan religiosity. We want to have the freedom to do what we want. So they moved out of the towns, they went out into the frontier, they established their own independent lives, and they began to live, they were the ones that forged into the frontiers. You had then these two things in interplay with one another in the history of early America. As the colonies began to get larger, they had a tougher time controlling, and you had the administered unit emerging as the key way to deal with the increasing larger society, the more complex units. The government of Massachusetts was really made up of a whole series of town governments and people electing the governor and so on. And if you look at the social system, as the colonies matured, they became more administered than they were before until they formed states. Quite a long time later, but that was the outcome of it. Here are the reaction groups that were critical of all the rest of the stuff that was happening. For example, I'm trying to think of something in the colonial period that would be appropriate for this. The people who were accused of witchcraft would have been a kind of group like this. Those who were really concerned about the Salem witches and the witches at Andover, some of these other places, the witches were in these segments of society. In other words, they were the ones who were they were either in the ruling group or they were these individualists that were accused of being witches. And there were these people who said everybody should be alike, there shouldn't be these people that are different, that began to attack and accuse these people of witchcraft. And we could go back and look at it and analyze it more statistically, but what you find is that in the settlement of America, in this early phase, you had all of these things emerging very quickly in terms of American life. Now, to talk about industrial just being, in actual fact, the early American was more peasant than it was industrial in terms of its being farming and producing surplus. New England became industrial with the turn of the Industrial Revolution, late 18th century, early 18th century on into the late 18th century, after you had the revolution, the dramatic transformation in industrialism occurred. But if you would look at the Indian societies, in America, subsistence societies, living right next to the colonists who were perhaps here when they started and paying tribute to England, the Indian societies would have been subsistence-oriented and would have had the same variation. The Iroquois Indians in New York, for example, would have fit into this corporate group right here. Corporate with a certain amount of grid, had a pretty well-organized structure, very strong militarily. And they were quite successful militarily. In fact, most of the northeastern Indians were wiped out by the Iroquois, not by the whites, because the Iroquois were taking over the beaver trading grounds so they could buy guns from the Dutch and the English who were settling downriver in the Hudson. So all of these things are part of the complex phenomenon of a changing society. Now, I answered you too long, right?
Well, I'm just curious if you can ever go from industrial and the corporate and all these separation to, you know, all the way back down to subsistence or aggregate, where everybody just breaks off and says, forget it, we're just going to splinter, we're going to go back down and try in little groups and people. It's almost like a change in regime.
What you will not have the disappearance of the industrial society, but you will have the withdrawal of people. If you go up into Idaho today, you'll find in Idaho a lot of people living at a subsistence level. They have just opted out of society. They may form any one of these variations in terms of small communities. And in other words, you'll have the individualist, you'll have the small egalitarian groups, and you might even have some corporate ones. I don't know about that. Usually you'll have these two low grid groups, because the reason they've gone to Idaho is they hate high grid. And they want to get out of high grid, and so they go down to low grid, and they either opt for the individualist low grid or for the collectivist low grid choices.
Put that on a bumper sticker, hate high grid, go to Idaho.
Sounds great. Okay. Now, anybody have any questions about that at this moment?
The government of Somalia, is that from the bureaucracy go down to aggregation? So
The question is Somalia. What's happened in Somalia? Probably what's happened in Somalia is the disintegration of the government, fragmentation, because the government apparently has collapsed. And so once that has collapsed, the whole society kind of falls apart. Okay? It becomes aggregation again, and then as it begins to fall apart in the aggregation, what you see occurring is that there's a whole host of people who are starving to death and who are living helpless lives as individuals, no corporate relationships, no ability to work at all. There are some who are coordinated as gangs, who are working as gangs to try to sustain their interest, and there are some who are warlords who have power and a hierarchy of their own, and they've got their own corporate group, some kind of majority unit probably, or even a corporate unit, that are fighting with one another and who are keeping a government from being established and working in that situation to maintain their own individual power. So you have the tragedy of a large number of the population who are helpless in this context, and some gangs in coordinated units and some corporate units of people that have more power who are using that against the outside people that are trying to help and whatever else is involved. The reason the United States is considering sending troops into Somalia is because of these kinds of groups that are there in opposition to the government. But the government effectively collapsed. And so when it collapsed, you no longer have the administered unit. You have basically then whatever falls out being left, and that's what has to pick up the system. Now, if you think about this in terms of the church, you remember we looked at the whole cycle of the growth of the church a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the fact that the church moved from their identity in Christ into a coordinated group after Pentecost. And then as they began to find they had larger needs, they became a consensus group with the apostles providing the leadership. And then they moved to a majority unit where you had certain people chosen to be centralized leaders, the deacons in particular. Finally, you have this kind of corporate or perhaps even administered structure out of Jerusalem as you had the church maturing over time and the size becoming greater and all of these things becoming a component part of it. In the previous diagram that I've showed you, I've only listed 3 things here. But if you notice the chapter in Adams, he has about 7 levels. And what he's arguing in his chapter is that this can replicate itself over and over again. In other words, that I have just done this very simply. I've said subsistence, peasant, and industrial. But what Adams suggests is that this goes through a whole series of political phases. And so as the political life becomes more complex, what you have is the development of a whole series of steps that, let's say, from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And all this is a typology, basically to give you some sense of the changes which occur in society. Now, what is the importance of this? Why do we go and talk about it? Why do I spend any time at it at all? I started out with the illustration tonight that Jesus saw all the kingdoms of the world. And as he looked at all the kingdoms of the world, Satan said, you can have this if you'll just bow down and worship me. If we look at the church, the temptation is for the church to follow the same patterns of the kingdoms of the world. If we think about the church in the context of its growth, in terms of its development, we have a lot of emphasis today on church growth. And church growth basically is to increase in size, to gain more converts, to reach out into the world and to develop larger and larger evangelized communities. And that's a good goal. It's a very important goal. But the temptation will be to use the agendas of the world, to use the systems of the world to try to accomplish that. And the truth of the matter is that the only way to truly accomplish it is through the cross. That there is no other way, that there is no other agenda. You did your comparative study papers. And as you did your comparative study papers, you compared social systems, political systems, economic systems. This thing that I've done for you here is a finer way of fine-tuning that comparison, of beginning to see that, oh yeah, there are economic differences, there are variations in terms of levels. And part of the confusion sometimes, I know in some of your papers as I look through them, you said, well, we've got this problem that the government comes in and intervenes, the government establishes a new system, the government creates its own bureaucracy, and so you've got a traditional system and a bureaucratic system. Stephen saw this particularly in Nigeria, where you have a traditional system and a bureaucratic system. Which does the church participate in? Probably both. What you find in a society like that is that in the local churches, some of the traditional system plays into the life of the people. And yet at the same time, because the church becomes a national organization, it adopts some of the bureaucratic systems of the national state. And we have schools, and so the schools become bureaucratic systems, and we begin to interplay with the local systems and the national systems. Now, in all of this process, if we lose sight of the fact that the church truly is the body of Christ, if we lose sight of the fact that the church is something that is to be transformed to be different from the world, we then will become more concerned about how the church works effectively as a bureaucracy, or how the church works effectively in the local community and how it fits, than we will be with how the church transforms, how the church is an agent of change, how the church is an agent for bringing people into a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ and becoming anti-cultural, if you will, or at least countercultural in terms of its dynamic. Not anti-cultural in the sense of being against culture, but countercultural in the sense of calling us to a new and different way in Christ. Now, as we think about these dimensions, Adams is useful to us because he helps us to see what the pressures are at each point to cause people to conform. And so what I'd like to do in the time that I have remaining, which is very short, is to take a look at some of the things that Adams talks about that shows us where the pressure points are. The process of growth and centralization, the dynamics of growth, one of the first things that he notes is population growth. One of the things that spiritual leaders don't understand is that when the population of Christians grows, it brings about special problems. And you need to be prepared to cope with those problems spiritually, as well as economically and politically. Those dynamics are there. And what we know for certain is that population growth creates a dynamic pressure for a change in these phases that we've talked about here. As we looked at the previous diagram, population growth generally moves people to coordination, centralization, and fragmentation. We saw that in the early church. Population growth caused these things to happen. We know that's there. So how do we cope with that spiritually? What are the issues that we have to deal with as we look at that? The second thing you see is that dynamics of growth have to do with resources. The greater the resources per capita, the more you have allocated and delegated power. Now, if you don't teach your leaders how to deal spiritually with allocated and delegated power, to understand what it means as the church gets richer, what it means to be a servant, leaders fall. Boom, like that. Okay. If you take a church that's successful, and it grows significantly, then one of the things that automatically happens with that is its resources grow. What does that church do with its resources? And how do they use it? You can compare a church that uses its resources for itself and the church that uses its resources for the evangelism of the world and see they're quite different. For example, I know a Korean church, 10 years old, not very far from here. And it has about 3,000 members. It has a budget of $5 million, $3 million for missions, and $2 million for its local operations. Now, what that church has said is that this missions is a very significant part of our work. It's a very critical part of our ministry. In fact, the pastor spends almost as much of his time overseas as he spends here, because he is committed to the outreach of the church in other parts of the world, and that to him is more important than continuing to make the church bigger here. If you took my local church spends probably 70% of its budget on its local means and about 30% on missions. Much smaller church. But, you know, our proportions are different. We have to think about these things. What do we do with our resources as we grow per capita in terms of our ability to use our resources? The next thing Adam's talked about is oscillation. That as units grow, they will tend to move back and forth between centralized and coordinated groups. This kind of oscillation here will occur. High grid, low grid, back and forth. Again, that's helpful to know, because if you remember that dynamic, we've seen that in the dynamic of the early church, we see it in the development of churches everywhere, that the bigger the group is, the more you've got to have some kind of bureaucracy to deal with it. But how big a bureaucracy? To what extent do you lose the dynamics of outreach? My church right now is struggling with that, because the church wants to keep unity. It wants to be together, but if they grow too much, they lose it. And so do they not want to grow? Do they want to just keep a nice, quiet little group together where we can all be good friends? And those are some of the struggles that they have to deal with. So the dynamics of growth that Adams talks about are relevant to understanding churches, and we need to think biblically about how we deal with those issues. We need to try to understand what it means as we face these temptations to move in Satan's way or to move in God's way. Now, the characteristics of each level are important, because the characteristics tell us what binds people together and what you need to look for. For example, coordination, the linkages are kinship, language, reciprocal exchange, heritage of faith, and common values. So if you look at that, a local church that is primarily at this level of coordination, the key agendas that are going to come into the life of the people are kinship agendas. Jenny saw that in her paper on the Eskimos. Kinship relationships is a key dynamic in terms of how people united and what bound them together. And so one of the big problems you have to look at is what are the kinship kinds of contexts. Decision-making is often either individual or coordinated groups operate in that framework. And the coordination becomes the key dynamic within which the church will operate. If you go to centralization, you have the things that we've already talked about before, the transformation into allocated and delegated power, and decision-making moving up to some kind of collective, consensus or majority kind of decision process. Now, the key thing to understand here is that kinship no longer is as crucial. Many of you did studies, for example, Murray's in Cameroon, looked at societies that had kinship was there, but secret societies were probably even more powerful. And in some of them, the hierarchy, a king, and coordinated work through the kingship being a very important agenda. In Palau, very highly structured system with hierarchy and high grid. And so the church responds there not so much to the dynamics of kinship, but more to the dynamics of grid and the grid relationships. In Truck, in contrast, kinship was the most important. Coordination was the type of group that you're working with. And so those linkages will begin to help you to understand where the pressure point to conform it to the world will come from. And in truck, conformity is a kinship issue. And the kinsmen draw the church into their net and conform it to their own relationships. Whereas in maybe the Bafut area, the whole notion of the political power and the struggle for power and the competitive struggle of leaders may be a more important agenda than is the kinship one per se, or maybe the secret society. I'm not sure. With the Eskimo, it will definitely have to do with the kinship kind of relationship. If we understand these characteristics of these levels, then we can better understand the places where the society and the church are going to come into tension with one another, and where the church will be conformed in the likeness of the local system. Fragmentation is characterized by strong power at the top, very powerful leaders, and everything splintering. People being segmented from one another, becoming factioned, breaking up into factional relationships, and probably you can identify places where that has happened in terms of the kind of societies that we look at. So as you look at these characteristics on page 54 of your syllabus, you can see that each one of them identifies certain features that are part of the processes that Adams is describing. The last thing that he talks about here, which is probably useful, is the notion that societies are not static. I remember in reading some of your papers that in some cases trying to apply the concepts of grid and group, you said it's messy. Well, that's good, because you understand what Adams is saying is that it oscillates, that indeed is messy, that people don't just fit naturally into a pigeonhole, that society is really a dynamic process, and that this oscillation, this movement back and forth from one frame to another, is something that occurs and may occur from situation to situation, or it may occur from activity to activity. And so you might have, in a village, for example, in Yap, where I lived and worked, if you watch young guys going fishing, they're a coordinated group. But if you see the village going fishing, 3 weeks later, it's a corporate group. Because peer group fishing is very differently organized than village fishing. And so at one moment, the dynamic of the village structure plays it out, and another moment, the dynamic of the peer group structure plays it out. And the peer group is coordinated where the village is corporate. And the family is corporate. And so if you look at how they relate to one another, you've got that difference. If you look at where the guys go at 6 o'clock in the morning, they're getting up and going to work in town where they work in administrative units with the government, where they teach in a school. And so in this community, you've got people playing in different social arenas, participating in different structures that truly don't fit in any particular one of the boxes, but in fact represent all of the boxes. Now, I tried to express this back when I was introducing this subject in the beginning. But I want to try to come back and emphasize this now and think about it as you look at the book on Moses nursing father next time. And that is that usually in any complex society, all of these options are present at one time. And not in one social setting, because the social settings will vary through time and space. In other words, what changes is time and space. As you change time and space, then the particular social environment that will be operative will be changing. So for example, if you followed me through the week, you would find that when I go to my office, I'm in an administered unit. Okay? When I go to my church, I'm working in a majority unit. Home, probably a coordinated unit, huh? Okay, who knows, We'll see what happens at home. But this whole process is one where you go into different social environments. And it's one of those things where I may be individualistic in some of the things that I do. And my wife and I may choose to just separate ourselves from everybody on certain occasions and not identify with them. Probably the kind of relationship that I have here is more my relationship with Wycliffe, where I'm a participant, I'm not part of any hierarchy. We operate together in coordination with one another. We share certain kind of common things that I've been involved with them for a long period of time. And so that becomes kind of a group where everybody's equal, and I don't have any particular prestige there, you see. I'm not in any authority position. And so that would give me that kind of possible relationship. So depending on time and space, where I'm in time and space, depends on what particular social environment I'm in and what the rules are that I play by. Now, that's true in any social setting. And as you look at a social setting, time-space variables are crucial to understand what happens. As you do your analysis, it's important to recognize that. One thing I remember in studying the Dani is that when they get up in the morning to go working, they were always individualistic. But if they called a feast at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something happened in the village, which was really different. People began to clean up the plaza. And then they gathered in the plaza and they began to play games together. And then after they played games together, the chief would come out and bring food. And then other people would bring food. And they'd all gather together and they would start exchanging food. Well, they had changed from an aggregate unit or an identity unit into coordinated, even a consensus unit. Because at the feast time they said, we want everybody to have good talk. And we want everybody to agree with one another. And so the whole idea of the feast moment was to move from here to here and to have this moment. Now this moment might continue all night or until a fight broke out. And then when a fight broke out, then it could fragment. And suddenly it's no longer coordinated, it's no longer consensus. People lapse back into their identities. They begin to dispute with one another as family groups. And that creates then this kind of transformation, change in the community relationship. So if you keep that in mind, as you observe societies, you will see that time and space makes a difference. And so you need to control for time and space as you do your analysis using these particular concepts. The same thing will be true in terms of political leadership. Political leadership also will vary in terms of time and space and the size of the groups involved. Okay, we'll stop there and give you a break. Okay, our second lecture for this evening is lecture 22, page 57. The title is Stages of Leadership Training and Maturity. In the first lecture tonight, we were looking at the dimension of structure, social structure, political structure, and economic structure in relationship to leadership. And the whole purpose of that lecture was to give you a sense of the complex dimensions of structure for societies at all levels of economic life and at all levels of political life. In a real sense, that particular lecture was to try to tie together some of the strands of theory that we've been looking at through this semester and try to give you a picture of the cohesive whole and how they relate to one another. If you're lost, don't worry about it. It's not really that crucial that you understand all of that. But hopefully you'll be able to use what we've talked about to help you to analyze the situation that you're looking at in terms of your own ministry. This lecture that I want to give the last half of tonight focuses on leaders instead of on structure. It looks at where leaders fit into the structure and what the process leaders go through to become leaders within a structure. This particular lecture also focuses on a particular social environment. The idea of the ritual process, which we're going to be discussing, is particularly relevant to high-grid social environments. In other words, as we look at ritual process almost invariably is part of this high-grid dimension. Low-grid societies do not place that much emphasis on this kind of ritual that we're discussing this evening. For example, in a collectivist type social environment, which is high group but low grid, the rituals are mostly purification rituals and rituals of cleansing. They are not rituals of transition from one stage to another. So the process that I'm going to be talking about this evening is one of ritual transition in high grid social environments. The first thing that we're going to look at is rites of passage. And that in itself should make a statement to you. Rites of passage from what to what? It's from passage from one position in the grid to another position in the grid. That's really the nature of rites of passage. And so as we look at rites of passage, we are looking at the kind of ritual that marks the movement from one step to another. Here at Biola, just before Thanksgiving, we had an installation of a new Dean of Talbot. That was a rite of passage. It was a ritual in which we marked the stepping in to the position of Dean, a new person, a person that had not been in that position before. His previous position had been an associate dean, and then Dean of Administration. So the installation was marking the process of the change from one position into another. Rites of passage are that kind of ritual. They have to do with grid, and they have to do with moving from one place to another. Now, rites of passage have three different dimensions that are quite typically followed in other cultures and other societies. They're noted here in your syllabus: separation, liminality, and reaggregation. Separation is simply the removal from structure, stepping out of it. When you are going to be initiated into a new position, usually what happens, if the society is fairly complex, is that there will be a period of time in which you'll be separated out. You'll be taken out of whatever position you were in before, and you'll go through some kind of a training process. The example that I like to use in illustrating this is the summer training that they have in SIL. When I went to SIL back in 1975, I left the State University where I was a professor. My wife left it where she was a librarian, and we became nobodies at the University of Oklahoma in the Summer Institute of Linguistics. We're just like everybody else. We lived in the dorm. We ate in the same dining hall lines. We had no status, no recognition. We were really completely separate from our social environment in New York, taken out into another place, and for a period of time we went through this ritual called the Summer Institute of Linguistics. The notion of separation connotes also a state of liminality. Liminality means suspended social identity. And what that means is that whatever you were before, you're not that. When we went to the Summer Institute of Linguistics, it didn't matter where we came from. We were all suffering under the same professors and all going through the same trials and tribulations learning linguistics. And there was a great deal of pain and torture in that process, you know, as you went through those courses. So it was a time of you're not who you were before, and you're really not part of their organization either. In other words, you aren't even a member in training. You're basically somebody who's being examined to see if possibly you could be in that. Reaggregation is a process of moving back into the social environment or moving back into a position of grid. In the case of the SIL in the summer when I was there, reaggregation meant that you came to the Summer Institute, you went through the courses, and during that process you applied to see if you could be accepted in the organization. And at the end of the summer, provided that you'd passed the courses and you passed their other screening process and you demonstrated you had the biblical background necessary, you could be accepted into the organization at the end of that time. And you, at that point, if you were accepted, you could become a member in training. It would be the process of now you move from a candidate process into a member in training. So reaggregation would be now you move into the new organization, you now have a position. It's a low position, very low, but at least it's in. You know, now you're no longer an outsider, you're in. Then you would go through the process of becoming a junior member and finally becoming a regular member if you continued on in that organization. Well, this whole notion of rites of passage is one like that. We have another similar parallel here in America when we go through school. For example, I would say college is something of a rite of passage. You leave family. You leave your domestic home life. You are no longer a son or a daughter in the sense of your daily life in the household. You go off to college and you're a free, independent, young person who can do what you want to do, say what you want to say. Your parents aren't around watching. Now, it's never quite like that. But you know, what we find here at Biola is a lot of young people kick over the traces. You know, they're out. They can do what they want now. There's no parents to want. They can stay up all night if they want to. They can go out and not come back. I remember one of the big deals when I was in Wheaton is that a couple of my friends, we went into Chicago all night. Now my parents would have never let me do that, but I was a freshman, you know. And so I spent all night in Chicago on the streets. It was a terrible time. But, you know, we were able to do it. We were free. We could do what we wanted to do, and that was such a great big deal, you know. So the notion of being apart from society and being in this liminal state, college was really a liminal state, a state of suspended social identity, in the sense that you're a college student, you're not part of the structured society outside of it. Once you graduate, you've got to get a job. And at that point, you kind of move back in. And I remember when that happened to me, I actually was going on to graduate school, but I was married, we moved into a community, we began to attend a church, and people treated me differently. I couldn't believe this. You know, here I was treated like I was in society, I was an adult. You know, people older than me talked to me like I was somebody. I was no longer a student. And it's not that they wouldn't have talked to me in that way, but because I was married, because I was a member of the church, because I was part of the adult group, I was treated differently than if I'd been part of the college group, because college was somehow a suspended situation and I wasn't really in the society. So reaggregation is when you move into society, have some kind of a position within it. Now, in thinking about this, I've seen men in their 50s go through an initiation process to move them into a position of authority in a community. You have this happening with ordination, as when someone is ordained as a minister. It's the final reaggregation into a new position, a position of authority in a church. And their training before that has always been one of subordination, one of you're not really a pastor yet, you're still in a liminal state, you really don't move into that role until you have gone through the ordination process. So all of these are what we would call rites of passage. Many societies have rites of passage. Sometimes it can be rituals in a secret society. Sometimes it can be rituals that everybody goes through. Sometimes it's rituals that only men go through, sometimes only women. It varies from one society to another in terms of what it means. I'd like to talk about two phases of this that I think that are useful to us to understand. One is the liminal phase. What does the liminal phase mean? We define it here as a special period of suspended social relationships and significance. Van Gennep, who wrote about this many, many years ago, calls it betwixt and between. You're not really in society, you don't have a legitimate role in it, you're kind of in suspension. You're in a state of suspended expectation, but you're not really an active participant in a social relationship. And there's certain characteristics of liminality which are important and which are helpful to understand. Number one is seclusion. Seclusion means that you withdraw from normal social activity. Second thing is fasting. Fasting can be literally fasting and not eating, or it can be a restricted diet, in some way or another limiting what you eat from the foods that you would ordinarily have if you were in your family, in your regular social relationships, in your regular social position. The third thing would be other forms of deprivation. Sleep deprivation might be one. Sleep deprivation often occurs in military boot camp. Sleep deprivation often occurs when you're at SIL, which is missionary boot camp. Sleep deprivation could occur when you were being initiated into, let's say you're studying for your examinations for the CPA. And you go through a hard process of study, and you stay up long hours, and you go through a tremendous rigorous process to be able to pass that. I remember when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I really went many, many nights without sleep, working an intensive pace to finish this thing, to get through it. And so there was a lot of hard work, intensive study. Deprivation was a part of the process because I wanted to move into the position of having my doctorate. And so whatever I had to do, I was in a position of deprivation and subordination to those that were in authority over me until I could go through that process. Personal denial is part of the deprivation. Denial of your routine wants, denial of activities, so that if it's something that you really want to have, you will go through a substantive experience of personal denial to be able to move into that process. The fourth thing is that usually those who are suffering enjoy doing it together. In other words, that there is a sense of camaraderie, there's a sense of fun and interaction. Not necessarily that you have, that it's a fun process, but while you're going through it, the people that are going through it develop a sense of bonding together, a sense of community, a sense that they have something in common, something that's unique and special because of the experience. One of the things that happened to Judy and I when we were at ISCL back in 1975 was that we made friends that we still have today. We've visited them in other places in the world. We have really enjoyed their fellowship over the years, and that all happened in that bonding experience when we were all suffering from linguistics. So it's a process that produces this kind of social interaction and bonding with those that are going through it, where they have a sense of unity and belonging together. Now, as you think about liminality, some of the things that are part of that are interesting part of spiritual life. There are characteristics that we associate with spiritual maturity and spiritual growth. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit further as we go on. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of this ritual process is the notion of communitas. Communitas we can define as the emphasis of group over grid. Okay? I said that the ritual process occurs in high grid social environments. Well, communitas emphasizes group as opposed to grid. And so, in a real sense, it pushes in a different direction. You remember when the grid pushes up, group pushes in a different direction, not against grid, but across it. And so effectively, communitas is bringing people together in terms of some kind of group identity and some kind of group relationship. Now, one of the things that the ritual process does is it creates community among those who are going through it. Those who are going to go into a new position first develop a sense of belonging to a group. In a real sense, there is denial of grid in the state of communitas. Because no matter what you were before, when you were in this state of communitas, it doesn't matter. For example, you take SIL. I was a professor in the State University of New York. Nobody cared. Somebody else might have been just a college graduate. Didn't make any difference. In other words, no matter who you were before you came, you could have been a banker, you could have been the vice president of a company, you could have been a professor in the university, you could have been a college graduate who had no money at all, you could have been somebody who had just a new convert who had been a street bum before that. It makes no difference, because when you get into this situation of studying together and working together, whatever you were before doesn't count. What you're doing right now in this situation of learning becomes all significant, and you build that bond of group together. So prior position in the grid is irrelevant. Grid is really denied. Group becomes the focus. Now, when you graduate, of course, you go into grid again. But it's like boot camp in the Army. Doesn't matter where you came from. Absolutely no difference. Your heads are all shaved. You all dress the same way. You all interact the same way. You all go through the same pain and suffering. And in that process, you bond together. You bring together in a group. So the features of communitas, the first one is loss of status differences. That means it doesn't matter what you were before. It's irrelevant now. At this particular point in time, you are shaved head. Maleness or femaleness, you know, it doesn't matter. You're all suffering in whatever the situation might be. You develop a unity of persons. And that means that you bond together, you have a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. Your relationships are what we call face-to-face relationships instead of structured relationships. It's who we are in terms of our face-to-face conversation, our personal bonding. As we reveal our lives to one another, as we open our personalities and our spirits to one another, that's what happens there. Your structure, you know, we don't identify one another in terms of some position in society, some social class, some particular background. That's irrelevant. The fourth thing, a learning-teaching situation is crucial. Communitas always has both learning and teaching in it. We learn from one another. We may be taught. We may be teaching one another in the process. But it's inevitably a learning-teaching situation. Communitas involves the dynamic of being a learner. The last, not the last, this next to the last is the reversal of the natural and cultural order of things. In states of communitas, oftentimes the cultural order is turned upside down. Cultural order is rejected, it's denied. So for example, you may have a situation in which men and women don't do the traditional male and female division of labor. They all work together, doing whatever it is that needs to be done. And so the standard division of labor is forgotten. And you have instead a division of labor that grows out of the needs of the situation. I remember at SIL, it doesn't matter whether you were men and women, everybody worked in the dining hall. Everybody had some work to do. You had a work assignment. And you had to participate in the work assignment, and it could be that some men were cooking, it could be that some women were cooking, men would be serving food, women would be serving. It made no difference. The traditional sex roles were not observed in terms of those service activities. So the natural or cultural order, and I put those together because very oftentimes people define the cultural order as really the natural order, is often reversed in the state of communitas.
You're speaking specifically then of a communitas that occurs in the state of liminality.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. It's part of this liminal phase of transition. The last thing that is a term that is probably not familiar to you, but it literally means what it says, anti-structure is often a characteristic of communitas. And what that means is that it's not just cultural order is reversed, but in fact the whole system becomes structured in an anti-structural reversal. So that even the teachers sometimes are low. The teachers take a low position. I remember that's one of the things that impressed me about SIL, and that was that the teachers worked in the kitchen. The teachers took servant roles, just like the students did. That there was a sense that we were all part of the same bonding, all part of the same group. Now the teachers had offices, but the teachers didn't dress any differently than the students. The teachers played volleyball with the students. There was a sense of real bonding and mixing together in this group, so it was very different from an ordinary college structured situation. It was really anti-structural to college. It wasn't like ordinary college. It was a different kind of learning because there was a bonding that was created between the teachers and the students that was unusual. The features of anti-structure sometimes are a little bit difficult to get at in terms of trying to figure them out, but there are some very powerful illustrations of anti-structure in the Gospel of Matthew. Anti-structure is when you do things that are different from what is socially expected. For example, when Jesus began healing, the first person that came to him was a leper in Matthew chapter 9. And Jesus did something that was completely and totally unacceptable. He touched him, you know. And so in doing that, he just was anti-structural. He did what everybody else would have said is absolutely impossible. You cannot do that. Anti-cultural. It turns the culture upside down. He reached out and touched that man, and then he said, "You're healed." It's interesting that the next person that he healed in Matthew chapter 9 was another against structure healing. A Roman centurion sent a message to him and said, "Can you heal my servant?" Now, if there was anybody that was almost as bad as a leper, it was a Roman. I mean, there's nobody else that could be worse except a leper. And so here you have a Roman coming, and a Roman says, "Can you heal my servant?" And Jesus says, "I haven't even seen this kind of faith in Israel." And the servant is healed. The third one is the third most horrible person, a woman. For you women here, I apologize to you. But that's the way it was in Jewish society. The Jews said, they used to pray, "I thank God that I wasn't created as a woman." You know, that this was their attitude. And this is how they looked at it. So if you look at what Jesus did, he started with what the Jews thought was the most abhorrent. He healed a leper. And then he healed a Roman servant. And then he healed a woman. Okay. In each one of those things, he showed compassion and care for those that the society had rejected. And so his message was very blatantly anti-structural. It was one that that was counter to everything that society expected. And it turned the social expectations upside down and said, these rules are a lie, in effect, by what he did. So if you look at anti-structure, it's that kind of reversal. It's the thinking about society in such a way that the dimensions of it are turned upside down. Now, I've gone through this because I want to suggest to you that maturity, Christian maturity, can be enhanced by understanding this process. That as we work with training Christian leaders, as we begin to try to help them understand this, that this social dynamic can be important in terms of helping to equip and train Christian leaders to become mature believers in Christ. It's interesting that the whole discipling process that Jesus goes through in the Gospels is parallel to what I've just described. And to help you see that, if you flip the page to page 58, we'll just take a look at the Gospel of Mark and the dimensions of the Gospel of Mark that illustrate for us the training of the disciples. The first thing that you will notice, if you want to just leaf with me through the Gospel, in Mark chapter 1, verse 16 to 20, you have the calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And in this process, Jesus is walking beside the Sea of Galilee. Simon and his brother Andrew are casting their net in the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said, "Come, follow me." Jesus said, "I will make you fishers of men." And it says they left their nets and followed him. Now, this is what I would call an act of separation. Okay? They're in their jobs. They're at work. It's basically what the Scripture says. Jesus comes along and says, "Follow me," and they leave work and they follow him. It's not doing what society would expect. If everybody did that on society, society would collapse. There would be nobody working, there would be no food. It's definitely an act of separation. If you go to Mark chapter 2, verse 13 and 17, the same thing happens to Levi. Verse 13 says, "Once again Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him. He began to teach, and he walked along. He saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth." Again, he's at work. Okay? And he's doing what tax collectors do. He's at his booth. Jesus says, "Follow me." And Levi got up and followed him. And so he left his job, and he too was separated. Now, you see that he then went to Levi's house. There were many tax collectors and sinners eating there, and it follows on. But the next text we find is in Mark chapter 3, verse 13 to 19. And in this particular text says that Jesus went up into the mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. And so at this point now, he's truly called them out. He's gone up into the hills. And at this particular place, he appoints the 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. So in effect now, he's truly calling them from their work. I mean, he was at Levi's house, but Levi's no longer allowed to stay home. Now the goal is to be with him and to be sent out to preach. And so Levi's got a new job. Now in the process of doing this, there are some certain things that follow. And what I would suggest to you, the first phase of this, I'm calling pollution. It's not new to me. This really comes out of Victor Turner's work on the ritual process. But the pollution phase is the phase when you're in society. You're in your ordinary work. You're polluted by the ordinary things of your social relationship. Again, pollution is a characteristic feature of high grid. And so to be polluted is to be involved in the routine work of the gridded system, if you will. Purification occurs in the liminal state. Okay, the whole purpose of a liminal state is to become purified. If I can explain it this way, one of the purposes of separation is to leave behind whatever it is that you had before. To give up whatever it is that you were committed to kind of drop out of that particular framework and to take on something new. So almost by definition, what was there before is polluted. It's no longer acceptable because you're going on to something different. So in this case, the notion of this is that for those called out, they now had to go through a process of training, a process of purification, a process of being prepared to do the work that Jesus was going to have them do. And in this process, there were a number of phases that are part of the kind of thing that we talked about before. You notice the liminal phase, all the things that are part of liminality and communitas on the previous page are going to appear now in this part that I'm talking about as liminality. The first thing is instruction, that Jesus began to teach them. Mark chapter 4, Jesus began to teach by the lake, it says. The crowd gathered about him so large he got into a boat and sat out on the lake. He taught them many things by parables, verse 2. As we go on, the disciples, verse 10 says, when he was alone, the 12 and others around him asked him about the parables. And he told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but those on the outside, everything is said in parables. So you see there's a clear distinction between those that are inside and those that are outside. And these disciples have been brought into a part of an inner group. They're part of a group that's going to be taught. And the instruction that Jesus gives them is the instruction to help them to understand. And notice what it says in verse 12. The secret is given, the kingdom of God has been given to you, but those on the outside, everything is said in parables so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise they might turn and be forgiven. Okay. So that those outside, you see, are not capable of comprehending. They're not capable of being purified. They're not capable of responding to God's word in a way that they will live new and transformed lives. So the purpose of Jesus' message is to teach these men the way that is his way, the way of life. Matthew 5 through 7 are then all of the teachings. You have much going on in these chapters. 5 has to do with the healing that I described earlier. Jesus teaches, he heals the 5,000. You have the discussion of the clean and the unclean in chapter 7. Chapter 7 really is interesting because chapter 7 focuses on the issue of purity. Remember I talked about the whole notion of things being pure. Well, let me, before I rush to that one, let's go back to Mark chapter 5. In Mark chapter 5 you have the reversal of the natural order of things. The first thing is you have a demon-possessed man. In this case, no one was strong enough to subdue him. Jesus cast out the legion of demons, and you know, they went into the pig by the sea. So that here's the whole thing here is something that is traumatic for the people that are watching. The people, verse 17, pled with Jesus to leave their region. I mean, what he had done was completely in opposition to everything that they understood and knew. In other words, he was so powerful, the kind of thing that he did was just beyond their comprehension. They wanted him to leave. Then you have a dead girl raised to life again. How many times have you seen that? Okay, is that natural? Of course not. It's completely unnatural. It's completely against the natural order of things that we're going to talk about, that we would talk about. And so in this chapter 5, you have the kind of things going on are the turning over of what people see as the routine, the natural order. In chapter 6, you have what we call relative deprivation and testing. The 12 were sent out. But notice their baggage. Okay? How many missionary barrels did they have? How high was their support level? They had 0. 0. In other words, they were not said, okay, we're going to send you out. We've got $40,000 worth of support raised for you. We've got an outfit component ready for you so that you're going to get there. You're going to be in great shape. He sent them out with nothing. He said, even if you have it, don't take it. No bag, no extra clothes, no money in your belt. Okay? Wear sandals but not an extra tunic. So It was a choice of deprivation. And their training and their process was to go through that deprivation so that they could understand what it meant to depend upon God.
So today's situation is unbiblical?
No, this is a liminal state. Okay? Okay, this is a training period. Okay? Now, if you went through this training period, probably when you were ready to go the next time, you wouldn't need that much. In other words, having gone through the state of training this way, you're much more capable of living this way. But that doesn't mean you have to live that way. And in fact, there's evidence that not everybody went that way. You know, we don't really know exactly. We know that Paul worked where he went, that he made money as he went. And so he obviously had money to support himself. But there are times when he was also supported by the people that were sending him. And sometimes he was kept in homes, and sometimes he maybe had to pay his rent. We don't really know. He doesn't give us all those details. But here in this case, this was the training period. And the training period was to teach them to go with nothing. And I think that's important. Part of it is the testing. Are they able to endure with nothing? And so this is a process of what we would call a testing, being sent out with nothing. Okay. The next thing I've noted on number 4 in your outline, Mark 6, is the people are in focus. Jesus is person-focused in his ministry. You remember I talked about face-to-face relationships, relating to people as persons, dealing with them in a personal kind of way. Jesus, in this situation where he fed the 5,000, wanted to get away into a solitary place, verse 32, but many saw him leaving, recognized him, ran on foot from all the towns. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, it says he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. In chapter 6 and verse 34. Okay, as you think about this, as you watch Jesus in his ministry, anytime people come to him with a need, those people are in focus. He doesn't turn people away. When the disciples were driving away the children, he said, "Bring those children to me." And then he blessed them. Now, if you remember blessing in the Old Testament, blessing is a very special act. You remember what Jacob did to, Isaac did to Jacob, and how distressed Esau was that he didn't get the blessing. Jesus blessed these children, it said. He gave them a special blessing, which was an important part of his ministry to them. So that the people were in focus in terms of Christ's ministry in this context. And this is what he was teaching his disciples. Okay? The fifth thing is the notion of anti-structure. And you see this most clearly in Mark chapter 8, verse 34 to 38. In this section, Mark chapter 8, by the way, is very interesting for a number of different reasons. But let me look at the verses that I've marked for you, and then I'll come back and look at some others. 8:34 to 38, he says, "Then he called the crowd to him with his disciples and said, 'If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory and with the holy angels.'" Now in this particular passage, Jesus is preaching anti-structure. He is basically saying that all of the structures of society that are characteristic of social life are in opposition to what I'm calling you to. And if you want to follow me, anyone who wants to follow me has to be willing to give this up. Take up your cross and follow me. And then he says, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. If you want to preserve the things that you are familiar with, the things that are part of the social structure, that are part of your routine of your life, that those things are in the way. Now, if you keep this in mind, this is all part of his training process for his disciples. He's preparing them for ministry. He's getting them ready to be the leaders of his church. And this is part of the training process. If we don't do this in our training process, it's not complete. This is one of the things that frustrates me most about our training here at Biola. And that is that there's no deprivation at all. You know, you eat better here than you eat at home. There is no sense of denying yourself and taking up your cross. There is no sense of the kind of complete transformation and reversal of life that you might have in this kind of framework. There is no sense of going into ministry without all of the comforts and all of the other activities, the kind of things that are part of our world. Now, it does happen in a few small pockets. You know, I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, but it's something that's not just a pervasive part of what we do. You know, it's not our life. We really are conformed to the world. We've got an educational life that's very much like UCLA and USC and any other place you could go. It really doesn't bring us into this kind of liminal phase of training that Jesus had for his disciples at this particular point in time. That's one of the reasons why I like SIL, because the program at SIL has a lot of these components to it. Maybe not as much as it should have. Maybe there should be a little more suffering in it. But you know, it does have these components which we don't have here, which are not part of our social structure in this framework. The other dimension of this chapter that I thought I would mention to you is in verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, Is it because we have no bread? Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, Why are you still talking about having no bread? Do you not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. He said to them, Do you still not understand? Now he doesn't explain it anymore. So what is he talking about? Well, if you go back and look at the text, the yeast of Herod refers to the story when Herod executed John the Baptist. And if you look at that, Herod, first of all, fell into the sin of the lust of the flesh. The dancing of Herodias' daughter pleased him, pleased his physical desires, and so he promised her anything that she would want. Okay? Okay. The second thing he fell into was the pride of life. When they came and asked him for John the Baptist's head, he was ashamed to go back on his word. He'd made the promise in public. He didn't want to embarrass himself. He was too proud and too much dignity to go back on this. And so he then executed John the Baptist for the sake of his oath and because of his guest, it says. Now the yeast of Herod is that when we submit to the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, that those are the kinds of things that creep into our lives so easily and that deceive us. And that's really the yeast of Herod. The yeast of the Pharisees. That's right, hypocrisy. The yeast of the Pharisees is their pride at their righteousness. That we wash our hands before we eat. We perform all the rituals that are appropriate. We've got everything down so that we do it well. And they said to Jesus' disciples in chapter 7, they saw the disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, and they said, Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? And so the yeast of the Pharisees was living according to the tradition of the elders, being conformed to their culture, following the rules the way it was in terms of the way they had done it in the past. Both of these things Jesus then says, beware of them. And then he comes across with the statement we began with. If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross. So you see effectively what Jesus does is he rejects the Pharisees and their pride and their culture, and he rejects Herod and his pride and his arrogance in terms of fulfilling his own personal desires, and says neither of those are appropriate ways. And that the way that I'm sharing with you is the way of the cross. Denying yourself, taking up your cross, and follow me. Okay, the whole message then of Jesus is one of against structure. And that's another evidence that I have for the fact that the gospel is countercultural, that the culture is a prison of disobedience, that the culture is what keeps us in its own frame, and we have to be able to break out of it to be able to do what God wants us to do and to build His church. Now, in Matthew 7, the whole purpose of Matthew 7 is to teach purity. And I'm sorry, Mark 7. Mark 7. Matthew 15 is the parallel passage. Mark 7 is the whole discussion of the Pharisees. Jesus brings it around to what really truly makes us unclean. In verse 20, he draws his conclusion. He says, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, evil, slander, arrogance, and folly. In those words, he summed up the yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. So the issue of purity and impurity is a very important issue for the Lord Jesus Christ. But it's not as the Pharisees saw it. It's as he sees it here in relationship to the heart. And the whole purpose of his teaching for his disciples is to bring them to a point where they understand that purity comes from the heart. And that purity is a transformed heart. Purity is from a heart that is renewed in Christ.
You said that the whole message of Christ was against structure. Would that not mean that kingdom organizations would all fall into, let's say, aggregate or coordinate units versus centralization or more centralized bureaucratic organizations?
Anti-structure is not against structure. Okay? There's a difference. Okay, so you want me to explain that, right?
Please.
Okay. Antimatter is not against matter. Antimatter is the mirror opposite of matter. Okay. Okay, so if you can try to understand that conceptualization that matter exists, okay, antimatter exists. Okay. They're like the poles of a magnet. They exist in their relationship to one another, and that they coexist, so that the kingdom of God coexists with the kingdom of darkness, and that until the kingdom of darkness is completely defeated, they will continue to coexist. And I don't know what will follow that, because all I know is what it speaks of in Revelation, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. When the kingdom of darkness is wiped away, there will be something new that comes out of that, which I don't comprehend in my feeble understanding.
The structure is evil, then.
The structure is matter, you know, in the sense that it's part of it you have to understand is that it's like our bodies. We can't live without it. Okay, so if we want to call our bodies evil, yes, they are. Okay, but no, they're not. Our bodies can be sanctified. Okay, likewise, our social structures can be sanctified, but only through their relationship with anti-structure. And that's the spiritual dimension that comes to play into our lives. It's a subtle distinction, but it's a very important one, because the church can never be completely divorced from society. It cannot be without grid and group. It has to have grid and group. Okay. So then how does the church become like Christ? Through perhaps liminality and transformation. It's a suggestion to throw out. Liminality is that state when we separate ourselves for the purpose of being taught God's Word. When we deny ourselves for the purpose of understanding that the reality of life is not what we've attached ourselves to, but something more important, something deeper and spiritually. At that point, then we can re-engage. We re-aggregate back into society to do the work, because the work has to be done. These disciples, for 3 years, were with Jesus, but at the end of that 3 years, he was taken from them, and they had to go back into another life. They had to begin to eat and feed and care for people, and they had to take on responsibilities and routines. And so the church began to grow out of that, but it was church in society, not apart from society. And it was a church that began to grow and change as the population grew. It went through all the things that I talked about in the previous lecture. It moved from a coordinated unit to a centralized unit to a fragmented unit, and it went through all of that dynamic process. So what am I saying? I'm saying that the continuous renewal, the continuous spiritual vitality of the church is based upon it going through periodic phases of liminality. We may call those revival phases. We may call them phases of Pentecost. But to really keep ourselves true to God's Word, we've got to engage the anti-structural dimension of our spiritual life. And if we neglect that anti-structural dimension, not against structure, but anti-structure, to be participating in that anti-structure means that we pull out of structure for a while, we learn to reject it, we begin to see that it's not the essence of who we are, we deny the power of those statuses to give us fulfillment, we recognize that it's only in the cross that we find joy, we're able to give up all the dimensions of life that are so important to us and say that we really don't need them, and we go back and we study the Word of God again, we find the truth once again that there is no life apart from Christ, that all of the things that we've become so preoccupied with are illusions and foolish, and that purity is out of our hearts, and our hearts become pure in our relationship with God. And as we go through that anti-structural moment together, and we see this in our lives, we come out of it, as I've noted here in the outline, in John 13. And John 13 is the Last Supper. It's the time just before Jesus is ready to be crucified, and his disciples are going to be scattered, and then they're going to come together again, and then they're going to be scattered around the world, because the scattering after the Last Supper is symbolic of the scattering that will occur of the church. And at that particular moment, Jesus begins to teach them that he's leaving, going to prepare a place for them. There's one who will deceive him. And then he teaches them that they're to be servants. And he washes their feet. And he says, even as I, your Lord and Master, wash your feet, so also you ought to wash one another's. He says, you're clean, but not all. And it's interesting, in that particular passage, that meaning cleansing means, Peter, you've taken a bath, but you still need to be cleansed some more. And if you aren't cleansed more, you have no part with me. And that cleansing more was the washing of the feet, or what we would call in my denomination the process in our Christian life of having to be daily washed by the Word of God. That it's that daily washing of the Word that continues to cleanse us. We see that in 1 John. And so as we look at this whole liminal state, what I'm basically presenting to you tonight is that I believe that individual leaders and the church must go through periodic phases of liminality to maintain their vitality. And if they don't, they become stuck spiritually, they become stuck in terms of their maturity, they become conformed to the world, they become trapped in the frame of their social environments, and they lose their vitality and their strength.
Self-impose liminality? I would take myself out of structure and do it to myself, or if God doesn't do that to me?
No, I think that this is a spiritual discipline. Okay? That it should be a church discipline. And the church neglects it. And sometimes we as individuals do as well. It's one of those things where it's interesting as you look at this pattern of the ministry of Christ with his disciples. Jesus never rejected structure. See, that's why when John said against structure, I reacted. Because in Luke 15, I believe it is. I better look just to be sure. No, it's Luke 14. Jesus is at the house of a Pharisee, and he's sitting at the table. And he doesn't say the structure is bad. He doesn't say that it's bad to have places of honor and places of dishonor. He doesn't say that at all. He says the problem is that you want the places of honor, and you strive to get them. He doesn't say that it's bad to invite your neighbors over for dinner. He says you won't invite the poor. That's the problem. And so the issue is not that structure is evil. The issue is that the motivations of us as we use structure are always focused on having what structure has to offer. And we become preoccupied with it, and we become locked into it, and we become in bondage to it. And so anti-structure is an opportunity for us to come back and reflect, to begin to evaluate the nature of the structures that we're in and to recognize their insignificance. And so in that process, to go through periodic phases of liminality, to even program that into our churches and into our spiritual lives, I think would be very helpful. And some people actually do that. You know, there are some, for example, in certain Korean churches, they will have retreats. And retreats are not places where you go to eat better than you did at home and to have more fun than you would have ordinarily. Retreats, as the Koreans often define them, not all of them, but often, is a time of real sacrifice and deprivation. It's a time where you don't eat, you fast, you go to pray. You go to spend time alone with God and together in praise and prayer. And so it's a process of liminality. And when they go on a retreat, it's truly a liminal phase where they have made a commitment. We're going to go and we're going to sacrifice. We're going to deny ourselves. We're going to go through a process of giving up so that we can focus on what is more important in Christ. They come back to their Mercedes and to their homes and their businesses and whatever else that they might have. And I don't say that facetiously. I mean, I see them driving to church. But they go to a church where they've got a mission budget that is greater than their local church budget, and they give sacrificially every Sunday, and the Lord prospers them, and they continue to put it back into His work. And periodically they recognize that, some of them do, not all of them, that you can become in bondage to this. And you've got to be willing to say, I'm willing to give it all up again. And that's what I'm trying to say. It has to be something that you as an individual say, hey, I need this. One of my colleagues, Harold Dollar, recognized this has to be a regular part of his spiritual life. He says there are times when he has to fast, he has to be willing to give up whatever he has to renew his relationship with the Lord. And he does it because he knows that it helps him to grow. It's part of his spiritual discipline. And I don't think that he's got it scheduled for every June. I think there are times when he realizes, hey, I've grown cold in my walk with the Lord. I really need to spend some time apart again. And so he'll do that. And it'll be a part of his personal spiritual discipline. I think we need it collectively as well as individually. And what I described to you in terms of this political process in the previous notes here, this dynamic that we go through is one that has no liminality within it. In other words, it's a process that's full of different phases and full of oscillation. And where do you find, I think this is John's question, and I think it's a very good one. Where is the church in all of this? You know, what is the church called out to? And some might argue that really the church is, on the diagram that I've given you, in the core. Not committed to any of these, but somehow being called out. In the diagram in your syllabus, I've tried to show that as a phase of, in this particular diagram, you see that this is the cycle that leads to the phases. And if I could demonstrate this better, I would make it into a large spiral that just kept going upwards like this. In other words, going back to the first diagram that I showed you earlier, say we've got each of these phases, and the whole thing goes A, B, A, D, C, B, up to the next one, and through here and up to the next one, spiraling on up in terms of these complexity. But where is the truth of it as far as the church is concerned in any place? And perhaps the closest we can come to it is in the center. In other words, not committed to grid or group, but recognizing that we're being called out, that group at time has value, that grid at time has value, that weakness in one and strength in one are of value. It's a dilemma not to quite understand, but the way I am resolving it in my own thinking is that the only way we can keep a balance is when the church recognizes that it must pull out of whatever structure it is in for a time and renew itself in terms of its relationship with Christ as a community. And in that renewal, you have what we've got here at the bottom of the outline, reaggregation with power. You have crucifixion and the resurrection of the Christ, okay? Following that, you have the believers locked in a room together. And then you have the day of Pentecost. And the day of Pentecost is a time when they come out of the room and they come out into the world with great power. And that's really what liminality is about. You see, liminality is the beginning phase to move into the state of isolation so that when you come out of it, you come out of it with the power of God to engage in the ministry that He's calling you to do. And that's really the dynamic for the end process.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.